In May of 2000, Lucie Blackman and a friend flew from London to Tokyo to make money as a nightclub hostess in order to pay off debts. Even though she was only 21 at the time, Lucie had given in to the allure of credit cards and found herself in enough debt to make her feel hopeless about ever paying it all off. She had heard that young Western women could make a lot of money in Tokyo serving drinks and being friendly companions to wealthy businessmen. Her plan was to go for 3 months, make enough money to pay off her debts, and return home with a clean slate. Unfortunately for Lucie, not much went as planned after she arrived in the sprawling metropolis, and it was only when she finally felt like she was finding her footing that her life was suddenly taken. This is Monsters. Joji Obara was born on August 10, 1952 in Osaka, Japan. His parents named him Kim Sung-jong, which he would go on to change after his father's death. His parents were Zainichi Koreans who were Korean by heritage but had immigrated to Japan prior to 1945 and lived there as permanent residents. His family also used the Japanese surname Hoshiyama, but I'm just going to refer to him as Joji Obara throughout this story. Some of the Zainichi Koreans were forced to come to Japan to fight in the war or work in factories, but Joji's parents migrated to Japan voluntarily. When the Japanese Empire was defeated in World War II, the Koreans in Japan who had previously not held the same rights as Japanese citizens were suddenly liberated from their conscriptions and many returned to Korea. Joji's father, Kim Kyo-hak, stayed in Japan and began investing in businesses. He had a taxi company and some pay parking lots, then he started opening pachinko parlors. Pachinko is a gaming machine that can be used for gambling and is extremely popular in Japan. By the time Joji was born, his father was a rich man, and when he was only a toddler, they moved into the wealthiest neighborhood in the city. Kim Kyo-hak would be the richest man in Osaka for a time. Like many children born into privilege, Joji's parents thought they were giving him everything he needed to turn into a success. Before he even started elementary school, he was sent to a Roman Catholic nursery school and was tutored in violin and piano. Joji would later say that the lack of free time made him miserable, and he deliberately sabotaged his work in order to seem unworthy of additional tutoring. He would write with his left hand to make his schoolwork look sloppier, and he would wait until the last minute to start taking tests. When he began elementary school, Joji was enrolled at the school attached to the Osaka University of Education. He was described as a big kid who played baseball and was on the wrestling team. Though Joji sabotaged his own work to lower expectations, he was still able to get into a prestigious boarding school attached to Keio University in Tokyo, 500 kilometers or 300 miles away. At 15 years old, Joji was sent to Tokyo with a housemaid to live in one of the city's richest neighborhoods. In a new city, Joji began living by his Japanese name Saisho Hoshiyama full-time. The shame he held about his Korean heritage was masked while he was at boarding school. By the time he had moved to Tokyo, he had also had an epicantoplasty, which is an operation on the eyelids to remove skin from the inner angle of the eye to give the person a more Caucasian or Western look, and in Japan it was thought to make a person look less Korean. Many students there never knew he was of Korean descent and had never seen his parents or brothers. Still, his classmates would keep their distance as they found him odd. The housemaid looked after his general well-being, but Joji basically was a high schooler living on his own with pretty unlimited resources. People described him as materialistic and never willing to completely show his true self and make meaningful friendships. Joji was successful in the dating world and had a serious relationship with a girl named Betty. She eventually broke up with him, saying he was too immature. The event that happened in his teens that affected him the most, though, was the death of his father in 1969. Kim Kyo-hak had gone on a trip to Hong Kong with some other Osaka businessmen, and at only 44 years old, the circumstances surrounding his death were considered suspicious. Joji maintained that his father had a stroke, but people who knew him believed he had been murdered. Either way, at 17 years old, Joji inherited one of his father's businesses. Between his 4 sons, the eldest took over the taxi company, the second son took over the pachinko parlors, and Joji took over the pay parking lots, plus inherited a number of properties, including the house where he lived in Tokyo. The inheritance of the youngest son was unknown, but it's said to have been less valuable than what the other 3 brothers received. When Joji graduated from high school in 1971, he turned down an offer to enroll at Keio University, which was generally the reason students were attending the attached high school in the first place. Keio University is a prestigious university in Japan, and enrollment is extremely competitive. Attending the attached school gives students an almost guaranteed chance of getting in, and turning down the offer to enroll is very unusual. Though Joji had suffered a loss and inherited a business and properties, so it would make sense for his priorities after high school to have changed. Some say that his grades had suffered so much that he was going to be one of the rare few who was rejected from the university, so he preemptively turned down any offer to enroll. He had been drinking heavily ever since his father's death, and his education was no longer a priority. It was after graduating from high school that Kim Sung-jong, aka Saisho Hoshiyama, officially changed his name to Joji Obara. It's noted that the Japanese character he used for his last name could be pronounced Obara, Ohara, and also Orihara, but Obara is the most common. He attended Komazawa University for a short time before spending 3 years traveling the world. He lived in a number of countries and claimed to have become an acquaintance of classic rock musician Carlos Santana, though there's never been a confirmation that that's true. He would later show a picture of himself with the guitar player to someone, but that just means he met him and got a picture. He returned to Japan in 1974 and was accepted into a correspondence course at Keio University. After proving his grades with that, he was accepted into the university's undergraduate program. He went on to get degrees in politics and law. At both graduation ceremonies, he declined having his picture taken, and people said he hated being photographed. After receiving his degrees, he didn't seem interested in using them. He didn't begin working in either politics or law. He instead took advantage of the economic bubble in Japan at the time and began working in property development. After World War II, the Japanese economy recovered at amazing speed. Industries and infrastructure were rebuilt, and the education system was restored to an even higher standard than before. By the 1980s, Japan was leading the world in a number of industries, and with land prices rapidly rising, Tokyo became the world's richest city. Though the economy would stagnate in the late 90s, the city was recently named the world's richest city in 2025 with a GDP of $2.55 trillion US. In the 80s, Joji was able to take out a loan to purchase more than 20 commercial and real estate buildings throughout Japan. He made one purchase outside of the country, and that was an apartment in the Waikiki Beach Tower in Hawaii. He rented those spaces out and continued purchasing properties throughout the 80s and 90s. In 1996, he purchased a one-bedroom apartment in Roppongi, not far from the house he lived in when he was in high school, which he still owned. He also bought an apartment in a building right by the water in Zushi Marina, southwest of Tokyo. Most of the information about Joji's property accumulation was because there are records. You purchase property, it's on file somewhere. But when it comes to Joji's personal life as an adult, there really isn't much to go on. After his later arrest, his lawyer had him write a sort of autobiography to use in his defense, which is where a lot of information about his childhood comes from. It was never widely published, and only snippets have been released. But Joji didn't have anybody close to him as an adult who could come forward about what his life was like at that time, or at least nobody has ever been willing to. The closest thing to a friend that Joji had was a Shetland sheepdog named Irene. He would speak about Irene after his arrest, despite her having died years earlier. When she did die in 1994, he had her remains preserved, saying he hoped technology would advance, quote, in the hope of reviving the dog I loved so much. By the mid-90s, Joji looked like a major success on the outside. Multiple sources of income, multiple posh residences, and a number of expensive cars. A BMW, a Mercedes, a Ferrari, a Bentley, and a 1964 Aston Martin DB5, the car that James Bond had made the pinnacle of cool. The reality, though, was that Joji didn't know how to read the market and didn't stop purchasing property even after the bubble burst. He began planning to build a 12-story building at the location of one of his parking lots in 1993, which included some pretty garish designs, but the plan eventually fell through. By 1996, he was being sued by his creditors, and in 1999, his high school house in Tokyo was taken by the court. When rich people are in debt, it seems they're able to continue living lives of luxury, unlike us peasants. Even though Joji was in arrears with his creditors, it didn't stop him from treating himself to the finer things in life. The owners of a sushi restaurant near one of his properties remembered him making a delivery order for some of the most expensive items on their menu for days in a row, then they wouldn't hear from him for weeks. That apartment was the place he used as a base of operations to take dates after he had met them at one of the many hostess clubs in the city. He was a regular customer to clubs near his home in Roppongi, where he would purchase paid dates with the hostesses and take them to his seaside apartment. But for Joji, there were not just dates, they were conquests. Hello everyone! I just want to take a minute to remind you that I was part of an episode from the online streaming service Gamma Time. I participated in an episode called The TikTok Swinger Murder, where I played a YouTuber, I know, hard to imagine, who was one of the expert interviewees. Let's watch a clip of it now. News of this spread like wildfire, and the Beckett boys were already infamous. But now, they were at the center of a high-profile murder investigation. In the world of true crime, this is familiar territory. It starts the same way. A victim, crime scene, and the people closest to both. That meant the three guys living in that house. Sean, Freddie, and Colin. They have something for everyone, and there's even episodes that were written by Anthony E. Zeiker, the creator of the hit television show CSI. So if you like this show, you should head over to Gamma Time and check out the TikTok Swinger Murder. Then, while you're there, check out some other episodes. By downloading through my link as a gift, you can view my entire episode for free, but only if you use the link in the description or in my link tree. Thanks so much for your support, and be safe. Lucie Blackman was born on September 1st, 1978 in West Sussex, England. From birth, Lucie suffered from regular and severe rounds of tonsillitis. When she was about 2 months old, her fever caused her tongue to slide back and block her airway while she was sleeping. Fortunately, her mother Jane checked on her in time and she called an ambulance while her father Tim reached in her mouth and pulled her tongue forward, then did rescue breaths until the infant was breathing on her own again. She was rushed to the hospital where she recovered, and her parents said she never got tonsillitis again. The Blackmans went on to have 2 more children, a daughter named Sophie in 1980 and a son named Rupert in 1983. The year before Rupert's birth, the family moved a few miles away to Sevenoaks in the neighboring county of Kent. There they were able to send Lucie and Sophie to the Granville School, a well-regarded private all-girls prep school. Unfortunately, Tim's property development business was struggling and they weren't able to continue paying the tuition at the private school. The girls were enrolled in public school, but Lucie was academically gifted and eventually received a scholarship to a Christian private school called Walthamstow Hall, and it was even more posh than the Granville School. Being a scholarship student amongst the wealthy made it hard for Lucie to fit in, but it was her health that really caused her social life to suffer. When she was 12 years old, she came down with mycoplasma pneumonia, which is commonly referred to as walking pneumonia now. I read a quote from her mother Jane saying that nobody knew what was wrong with Lucie, which is weird because walking pneumonia was pretty well known in 1990. At the time, walking pneumonia would have been commonly treated with rest and hydration, but if it didn't go away, broad-spectrum antibiotics like erythromycin or tetracyclines were available and widely used for various forms of pneumonia in England. After she did recover, Lucie would go on for weeks at a time with no energy or strength, becoming exhausted by the simplest of tasks. Jane said that doctors couldn't assure them when or if Lucie would ever return to good health. Lucie slowly got better over the years, but time was not kind to her family. In 1994, Lucie's aunt died while surgeons were attempting to remove a large brain tumor, the same thing that had killed her and Jane's mother. The following year, Jane received a call from a man who told her that Tim had been sleeping with his wife. She confronted him and he admitted to the affair. In November of 1995, Jane kicked Tim out of the house and she started her life as a single mother. Tim's business had gone bankrupt, so Jane sold their big house and rented a smaller home in a less expensive area. Side note, the house they moved into was vacant because the previous resident had disappeared. That woman's body was found a year later buried in a garden in Bromley, just north of Sevenoaks. It's believed that her millionaire ex-husband hired a hitman to kill her due to a custody dispute, but he was acquitted of that charge. People close to the family said that, together, Tim and Jane were on the strict side, but after the divorce, Jane became much more lenient with the rules. People said that she and Lucie behaved more like sisters than mother and daughter. Being in a position where they were struggling for money and being someone who loved to shop, Lucie opted to go straight into the workforce after high school as opposed to attending university. After working a few odd jobs, she started working as an assistant at a French investment bank in London. She worked there for a year, having dated one of the bankers, but after a bad breakup, she became restless. She wanted to be able to travel, so she applied to become a flight attendant, what they called an air stewardess at the time, for British Airways. In May of 1998, she started a 21-day training course and from there began with short flights within Europe. A flight attendant at the time didn't make much money, so Lucie got by continuing to live with her mother. By early 2000, Lucie had been promoted to long-haul flights that took her to the US, Brazil, and even Zimbabwe. That increased her income some, but Lucie's debt continued to increase. She liked nice things, and using a credit card to get them was too easy. On top of that, she wasn't able to spend time in any of the places that she went. She'd arrive at the airport, crash at a hotel, and get up and fly out the next morning. She was quickly burning out, and that's when her close friend Louise Phillips suggested they go to Tokyo where they could make enough money to pay off their debt. Louise's older sister had worked in Tokyo a few years prior and told them they could make a lot of money. In the weeks leading up to the trip, people said that became Lucie's only focus. So much so that she broke up with her boyfriend who she had been talking about marrying before that. Some people said that Louise had a strong influence on Lucie and not always in a good way. It wouldn't be a surprise to learn that Louise had left school and started working at the investment bank in London before Lucie. Then Louise quit that job to become a flight attendant before Lucie. Where Louise went, Lucie followed, and this time was no different. Everyone in her life in England was begging her not to go, but she was an adult and she had made the decision. She wasn't going to back out. They told Lucie's mother that Louise had an aunt living in Tokyo they could stay with to ease her mind, but that was a lie. One of Louise's sister's friends in Tokyo had booked them a room. On May 3rd, Lucie and Louise left Heathrow Airport in London, headed for Tokyo. Their plan was to be there for 3 months, but Lucie would be dead in 2. The girls' accommodations were in the district of Roppongi, just south of downtown Tokyo. It was known for its nightlife, specifically the bars and strip clubs where both locals and foreigners went to find whatever type of companionship they desired. What Lucie and Louise had come for was the businesses that hire beautiful women as hostesses. They would simply pour drinks and make small talk with the male clientele. The girls were basically like rented-out girlfriends for the overworked businessmen while they were in the club. The girls could make up to $400 a night, which would be about $900 today. On top of that, they got whatever tips and gifts the clients offered. Of course, there were expenses to the lifestyle which counterbalanced the earning potential. They had to pay for their rented room plus clothes and accessories to attract customers. Also, after the work ended, the girls would go out themselves to blow off steam after a long night of feigning interest in lonely men. Lucie quickly ended up getting a hostess job at a club called Casablanca, but after 2 months, despite making more than she had worked for British Airways, she hadn't saved anything. After making minimum payments on all her debts and paying her expenses in Japan, she was left with nothing extra. Her plan to make enough money to pay off her debts in 3 months was abandoned, and she decided to extend the trip. After Lucie's disappearance, the idea of what the hostesses do exactly became quite scandalous. It was often compared to an escort in Western cultures, but Lucie's sister Sophie explained it by saying, quote, "The only difference between being a British Airways hostess and being at Casablanca was the altitude." And that was the truth. Lucie was not required to engage in any sexual contact with the customers, and physical contact was strictly forbidden in the club. The area also had strip clubs, but that was not part of the job as a hostess. They would mix drinks, mainly a cocktail called mizuwari, which is whiskey and water poured over ice, light cigarettes, and sing karaoke while keeping polite conversation. Hostesses could make extra money by going on what are called dohans. Loyal customers could pay to take one of the hostesses out to dinner in the evening and then arrive at the club with them afterward. Lucie had told friends that she was pressured to go on dohans, which she didn't like, but she was required to go on at least 5 a month. One of the women who worked with Lucie said she spent most of her time talking about the customer's day and showering them with ego-boosting compliments like how handsome they were or how well they sang karaoke. Some historians see the Japanese hostess as a modern-day geisha, a female companion and performer not engaging in sex work. Now, I'm not explaining any of that to defend this type of club or its clientele. The point is that there were tabloids that claimed that Lucie was an escort or engaging in some form of sex work in Japan, which was not true. Lucie had gotten a slow start in Tokyo. She was homesick and hadn't picked up regular customers as fast as Louise had, but by the end of June things had improved. She had also started dating a man named Scott Frazier from Texas, who was in the United States Marine Corps stationed aboard the USS Kitty Hawk that was at port in Tokyo. Her work prospects had picked up and she was distracted by her new boyfriend, which helped Lucie feel better about being in the foreign city. Lucie's last shift at Casablanca was on Friday evening, June 30th, 2000. Louise would later say that their shift went well and they met 2 young men who promised to take them on a double dohan the following week. They left the club at about 2:30 the following morning, went home and stayed up until about 4 a.m. talking over tea. That afternoon, Louise was still asleep when Lucie got ready to go on a dohan with a Casablanca customer. Louise said that she glanced over as her friend was leaving and saw she was wearing a black dress, a silver necklace with hearts on it, and sandals. She had not given Louise the man's name, but she said he was taking her to the beach and he was going to gift her a cell phone in exchange for the date. Lucie had called Louise 3 times during the date. First at 1:30 p.m. saying she had met the man, again at 5 p.m. saying she was being taken to the sea, and then at 7 p.m. saying that she would be home in 30 minutes. But she never came back. The next day, Sunday, Louise got a call from a man with a thick accent who claimed his name was Akira Takagi, and he said, quote, "Lucie has joined a newly risen religion. She is safe and training in a hut in Chiba." Lucie never returned home Sunday, so Monday morning Louise went to the police to report her friend missing. It was later that evening that she finally called the Blackmans and explained the situation. Jane immediately went into a panic. She called her other 2 children and told them to return home. Rupert started looking up newly risen religion on the internet. Jane called Tim, who was living in the Isle of Wight by then, and it was the first time they had spoken since their divorce. Their relationship had not gotten any better with distance, as was immediately clear when they each described the call. Jane claimed that Tim had no interest in trying to find Lucie and hung up on her. Tim claimed that he was trying to get more information when Jane accused him of not wanting to find Lucie, and she hung up on him. Nobody will ever know the truth, but Tim did end up traveling to Japan and spending a hefty sum of money in an effort to find his daughter, so it's hard to believe that he reacted that way. People said that Jane had a tendency to overreact and panic, which might have caused her to believe his questions were him hesitating to act. Either way, neither Tim nor Jane went to Tokyo right away. Sophie and one of Lucie's ex-boyfriends, Jamie Gascoigne, went to Tokyo first and began their search for the missing woman. In Japan, Sophie and Jamie went back and forth between the British embassy and the police station in Roppongi. They were shown mild concern at the embassy and indifference at the police station. After a week of almost no movement by people in Japan to find Lucie, the media picked up the story starting in London. Louise's sister went to the Daily Telegraph with the story, and soon it was national news. It was slower to pick up in Japan, though, as both the police and the embassy refused to comment to journalists. In order to get the news of Lucie's disappearance out to the Japanese population, Tim flew to Japan on July 11th and held a press conference. He had handed off the operation of his business to his business partner, secured a £29,000 line of credit from his bank, and put all of his effort into finding his daughter. He would end up spending £145,000 in loans and donated money in his effort to find Lucie. At the press conference, Tim answered questions about the case. He said that he believed the police were following all available leads, that he had been in regular contact with Lucie while she was in Tokyo, and that he did not believe she had run away to join a cult. When journalists came to the inevitable question of her boyfriend's role in Lucie's disappearance, Tim informed them that he had cooperated with the police and had an alibi. He was on duty aboard the USS Kitty Hawk all day Saturday. Unfortunately, the police might have been following all available leads, but up until then, there weren't many. Police claimed that privacy laws and telecom restrictions made it impossible to trace the locations of the calls Lucie had made to Louise or the call that had come into Louise the following day. The owner of the Casablanca was also unable to provide any details about the customer that Lucie had gone on a dohan with on the day of her disappearance. It was the Blackmans themselves who had gotten the case in the spotlight. Tim and Sophie would go on to distribute 30,000 missing posters and talk to everyone in the area where Lucie lived and worked. A friend of Tim's had done some work for Sir Richard Branson, the billionaire founder of Virgin Group that started with Virgin Records and expanded to an airline and a mobile phone carrier among other ventures. Branson agreed to supply the funding so the Blackmans could print flyers, and he instructed his staff in Tokyo to help the investigation any way they could. Tim and Sophie ran into a British businessman who lived and worked in Roppongi who donated funds and supplied an office in the area for the family to conduct their investigation from. It had a dedicated phone line that they published on the flyers as a tip line. Tim also relentlessly made contact with the British Foreign Ministry until the family were able to connect directly with Prime Minister Tony Blair's office. He was scheduled to be in Japan on July 21st, and while there, he spoke to Yoshiro Mori, the Prime Minister of Japan, about Lucie's case, and after that, the police were magically able to trace the phone calls from the day of Lucie's disappearance. Weird how that works, huh? Except they didn't actually do it. They had changed their tune and claimed they could get the phone records with a court order, but when Tim followed up, they told him they hadn't heard back. When Tim was able to get the British Consul General to accompany him to the police station, the officers told them that the phone company had not saved the information. The men then produced a letter from the phone company that specifically stated that they did in fact have the information, but the police shrugged it off. They said they had requested the information but hadn't received anything. The Blackmans were pretty much conducting an investigation into Lucie's disappearance on their own, but the police did receive a letter that was signed by Lucie, claiming she had disappeared of her own free will and didn't want to be found. The letter, that was typed, instructed her family to go back to England and she would call them there. Tim and Sophie recognized that, not only was it a bad forgery of Lucie's signature, the language didn't match Lucie at all. She wrote her family letters and she wrote in a journal, and it was easy to tell this letter had not been written by her. Eventually, the Blackmans' tip line received calls from two different women who had similar stories. Australian Isabel Parker and Canadian Clara Mendez had both worked as hostesses in Roppongi, and both had gone on to marry rich men they had met at the club. During their times as hostesses, they had both gone on a dohan with a wealthy Japanese customer who took them to an apartment by the sea. They both blacked out and woke up the following morning naked with no memory of the previous night. Isabel recalled the man was recording her with a video camera and she was able to grab the tape out of the device. She then used it to blackmail him for a few $100,000 in return for the tape. That would have been about 1,300 pounds or $2,000 at the time. It had been years since the attacks, and all the women could remember was an apartment by the water and palm trees. Gradually, other women would come forward with the same story, including Christabel Mackenzie, the friend of Louise's sister who had helped the women get settled in. Women from all over the world had been on a dohan with a rich man to a seaside house where they were drugged and raped. The man had always used a fake name, and the drugs made their memory of the exact location hazy. Only one of the women who had been sexually assaulted went to the police, but it did her no good. An American named Katie Vickers reported the assault to the police, and they showed almost no interest in the case. Sadly, since Katie still lived in Tokyo when Lucie went missing, when she heard the news she went to the police, but they still showed no interest in her story. After months of failed attempts to connect Lucie's disappearance to the drug trade, the Yakuza, or a cult, investigators finally drove Katie in the direction she remembered going the night she was sexually assaulted, southwest of Tokyo. As soon as they arrived in Zushi Marina, Katie immediately recognized the place. It was only then that the police pushed the phone company to trace the number that had called Louise the day after Lucie's disappearance. It came back to a prepaid phone, which didn't give them a name or address, but they did learn that the phone was sold in June of 2000 at a store in Tokyo and was one of 70 prepaid phones purchased by one customer. It was strange behavior, and they were able to trace all 70 phones, learning that only 10 of them had been activated. From there, they traced the calls of those 10 phones, and one of them had made 3 calls to Louise's cell phone on the day of Lucie's disappearance. Those were the calls that Lucie had made to Louise that day, likely using the phone she had been promised by her date. The last call it had made pinged off a cell tower near Zushi Marina, so the investigators took other previous victims there and they identified the building he lived in, but didn't remember the exact apartment. Police pulled records of each resident, and one of them came back with a criminal record. In 1998, Joji Obara had been arrested for peeping in a women's restroom with a camera. He was given a fine, but it was also noted that he had initially given the police a fake name. His picture was put into a photo lineup, and all 4 previous victims who were still in Japan easily picked him out. Police were able to find surveillance footage of the highway that showed a car registered to Joji driving from Tokyo to Zushi Marina on the day Lucie disappeared. The police wanted to make sure they had as much evidence as they could find on Joji before they arrested him. They put him under constant surveillance, and on October 1st, they learned that he had purchased a boat and was inquiring at a boat shop about anchors and rope. Then the media had picked up that the police had a suspect in their sights, and authorities didn't want Joji to hear that on the news and flee. Early on the morning of October 12, 2000, Joji Obara was arrested at the apartment he owned in Roppongi. They first charged him with the abduction and indecent assault of Clara Mendez as a means of holding him. Joji continually maintained his innocence, and police could only hold him for a certain amount of time. So when time ran out for those charges, they would turn around and charge him with the abduction and indecent assault of another victim. That gave them time to search Joji's properties, one of which would be a gold mine of evidence. Inside the apartment in Zushi Marina, authorities found video recording equipment, professional lighting, and journals where he recorded every one of his sexual encounters starting when he was 17. In that journal, he wrote about using sleeping pills and chloroform as a method of having sex with women. Inside the apartment, investigators collected several strands of hair, and when they were compared to DNA provided by Lucie's family, some of them were a match. There were also multiple rolls of undeveloped film in the apartment, and when it was developed, they found 2 photos of Lucie. She was wearing a black dress and a silver necklace with hearts on it. Joji would eventually admit that Lucie had been with him, but at first he denied any knowledge of her, so he just looked like a liar. He'd also have to explain why investigators found a piece of paper with Louise's phone number on it and a container of flunitrazepam in his apartment. That's more commonly known as Rohypnol, or the date rape drug. But the evidence against Joji didn't stop piling up. In the apartment was also a container of gamma-hydroxybutyric acid, or GHB, and 13 bottles of chloroform. On top of the journals, they found other notebooks, one that listed 60 women's names, each with the fake name he had used on them listed next to them. Joji had saved all of his receipts for decades, and investigators found a receipt for a purchase of 10 kilograms of dry ice made the day after Lucie's disappearance. He went back and purchased another 10 kilograms the following day. Now, you're probably thinking there's nothing more Joji could have provided to the authorities to prove he was a predator who had raped many women, but you'd be wrong. Eventually, investigators would find hundreds of video recordings Joji made of himself raping women. Those videos, what Joji referred to as conquest play, would lead to Joji being charged with not only multiple counts of rape, but yet another homicide. Carita Ridgway was born on March 3, 1970 in Perth, Western Australia. She was described as an energetic child, but after her parents separated, she grew depressed, and when she was a teenager, her mother became so worried she had Carita admitted to a psychiatric facility. Unfortunately, her doctor turned out to be a predator and was caught in the process of grooming her with private lunches. He was fired before he had been able to sexually assault the teen, but the situation did nothing to help Carita's self-esteem. When she left the hospital, she dropped out of school, and a few years later, she and a friend moved to Sydney. There she met a man named Robert Finnegan, and the two spent the next 5 years traveling the world, always returning to Sydney where Carita made money through odd jobs and modeling. Part of Carita's travels were to go to Tokyo with her friend and earn money as a hostess. They first went in 1988, then again in 1990. The following year, Robert was in law school and Carita returned to Tokyo where she worked as a hostess while her sister Samantha taught English. In February of 1992, Carita went to work at the club but never returned. Samantha was notified that Carita was in the hospital and she was not doing well. She was unconscious, so she couldn't tell anybody what had happened. A man had arrived at the emergency room with her, claiming she was having an allergic reaction to shellfish, but soon he disappeared. Carita's parents, Nigel and Annette, flew to Tokyo with Robert. Tests revealed that Carita was suffering from acute liver failure, and by the time her family arrived, she was being kept alive by machines. Her skin was yellow from jaundice, and nothing the doctors tried had any effect on her condition. After a week in the hospital, tests found no sign of brain activity, and her parents made the decision to take her off life support. Carita died on February 29th, Leap Day. After Carita's death, her family was left with no answers. Doctors assumed she was a drug user, but everyone who knew her said she didn't even drink, let alone do drugs. With that, the doctors suggested she had hepatitis, but couldn't say for sure. It was a suggestion the family believed was just as unlikely as drugs. The same man who had dropped her off was the one who had called Samantha and informed her of her sister's condition, and he called back a few times as Carita's health declined, but he refused to leave his contact details. After Carita died, he called and told Samantha that he wanted to meet with Nigel and Annette, so they went to a hotel in Tokyo, and only Carita's parents were summoned to the room. There, they met a man who said his name was Akira Nishida, and he went on to tell them that he loved their daughter. He said that they had spent the weekend together and Carita had eaten a bad oyster, which made her extremely ill. Then he gave them 2 boxes, one that contained a gold necklace and the other a diamond ring. He claimed he had been planning to give them to Carita for her 22nd birthday, which was only 3 days after her death. After having Carita's body cremated, Robert and the Ridgways returned to Australia and mourned their loss. Robert graduated from law school and began his career as a lawyer in Sydney. It was in October of 2000 that Robert saw the news of Joji Obara's arrest and immediately knew that he was Akira Nishida. Robert brought the case to the attention of his local authorities, and eventually the Australian embassy contacted the police in Japan. With that information, Carita's name began to stand out in the evidence collected from Joji's apartment. Investigators found a receipt for the payment of the treatment of Carita Ridgway from the hospital. In one of Joji's journals, they also found a note that listed her name with the detail "too much chloroform" written next to it. The police went to the hospital where they not only confirmed the identity of the woman, but they found that the doctors had preserved a piece of Carita's liver, which they were able to test and found traces of chloroform. Then the investigators went through all of the videotapes until they found the recording of Joji sexually assaulting the woman. In it, he can be seen continually putting a liquid on a rag and placing it under Carita's nose. It became clear that Joji had used too much chloroform, which poisoned her liver and caused her death. With that evidence, Joji admitted to being the man who had taken Carita to the hospital, but he denied everything else. Even though he was on video drugging and raping the woman, he denied it was true. As police built their cases against Joji for multiple counts of rape along with the crimes he committed against Carita, teams of officers were out searching for Lucie's body. They dug in areas around the property owned by him, but eventually narrowed their search area to the coastline near a second seaside apartment Joji had owned. As they searched, they came to a cave that was hidden from view from anyone who would be in the area casually. The cave didn't go far, but near its dead end, there was an overturned bathtub partially sunk into the sand. Once it was removed, officers started digging and quickly found plastic bags under the surface. Once the cave was fully excavated of sand, Lucie's remains were found, having been cut into 10 pieces with her head partially covered with cement. She was found on February 9, 2001, 7 months after her disappearance. Unfortunately, due to the condition of the remains, a medical examiner was unable to determine her cause of death. It meant that, without a confession, it would be impossible to prove that Joji had killed Lucie, and Joji was definitely not confessing. Lucie was one of the victims who was not among the recorded sexual assaults, and he had made no mention of her in his notes. All they could prove was that she had been in his apartment. When Joji's trial began on July 4, 2001, he was charged with 2 counts of rape leading to death, which would be similar to manslaughter, plus 8 other counts of rape. In Japan, defendants don't plead guilty or not guilty, but are able to offer a statement regarding their charges. Joji made a statement saying that he had not caused the deaths of Lucie Blackman or Carita Ridgway and that he had not drugged and raped any women. He said his relationship with Carita was mutual and her illness leading to her death was not caused by him. He claimed that he had met Lucie at the Casablanca and that she asked him out on a date, not the other way around. He said there was no arrangement to give her a cell phone and that they never had sex. They went to his apartment that evening and watched movies. He said that when he left her the following morning, she was alive and well. As for the 8 rape charges, Joji claimed that, despite the videos looking like the victim had been drugged, the sex was actually consensual. In response to the testimonies of victims directly saying it wasn't consensual, Joji's lawyer claimed that he believed that a hostess agreeing to go to a man's home was the same as consenting to sex, which is absolutely not what giving consent for sex is any more than wearing a short skirt. If you need to twist what consent is, you're likely a loser who other people don't want to sleep with. The prosecution of Joji had dragged out for years, and it gave Joji the opportunity to use Lucie's own diary entries to concoct an elaborate story about the woman that would cast doubt on the prosecution's case. He claimed that Lucie was depressed in Japan and became addicted to drugs. When they went to his apartment on July 1st, it was she who had given him drugs. They stayed up late talking and drinking, and the following morning, he left to go to Tokyo while Lucie stayed at the apartment doing more drugs. He returned that evening and believed that Lucie had taken too much and suggested she go to the hospital, but she refused. On Monday morning, he left again and had paid a man he only identified as Mr. A to pick Lucie up and take her home. He said he got a call later that day from a different man who said he was taking Lucie to the hospital. When Joji was updated about the situation later by the mysterious Mr. A, he was told that she was eventually dropped off with a rich acquaintance, quote, because she asked for drugs. In the days following, he decided to take his deceased dog out of storage and bury her, so he purchased tools to use for the burial of his dog and started making a handcrafted headstone, which created noise that caused the building owner to call out the police. That noise was theorized to have been made by Joji dismembering Lucie's body, but since he wouldn't let the police into his apartment, nobody really knows. When he was asked why he didn't go to the police when Lucie was reported missing, he claimed he had accepted drugs from her and didn't want to get in trouble. When the prosecution cross-examined Joji, he was vague and even flat-out refused to answer questions. When asked about the hundreds of notes he made about drugging and sexually assaulting various women, he claimed they were all fictional stories. Even the note where he explicitly wrote that he had used too much chloroform on Carita and he believed that that's what killed her, he claimed was fiction. The name and situation and fact that her liver tested positive for chloroform was just a massive coincidence. Sure. In the end, on April 24, 2007, Joji Obara was acquitted of the rape and murder of Lucie Blackman. The judges claimed that there was no direct evidence that proved he had sexually assaulted the woman or caused her death. He would not be a free man, though, as he was guilty on all of his other charges. For the rape and murder of Carita Ridgway and the rapes of 8 other women, he was sentenced to life in prison. In Japan, a prosecutor can appeal an acquittal just like a defendant can appeal a conviction. Both of those things happened in this case, and an appeal trial commenced in March of 2008 to provide additional evidence against Joji. At the end of that trial, Joji was found guilty of the abduction, dismemberment, and disposal of Lucie Blackman. In 2010, Joji's appeal against his original convictions was denied by the Supreme Court of Japan. If you dig into all the details of this case, there was some behavior by Lucie's parents that doesn't paint them in the best light. Both Tim and Jane made choices and acted in ways anybody might question, but at the end of the day, as parents who lost a child, the focus should not be on anything they did while they were grieving that loss. This story is about Joji Obara. Authorities have come to believe he drugged and sexually assaulted as many as 400 women starting as early as the 1970s. He used his wealth to draw in women, buy the tools he needed to drug them, and keep himself from getting caught. He believed that women were objects to use and discard as he pleased. No matter what type of lifestyle the victims lived or what kind of choices their family members made in the aftermath, the only monster in this story is Joji Obara. Thanks for watching This Is Monsters. New episodes are uploaded twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays. There are occasional bonus episodes covering unsolved cases and criminal history. If you have a suggestion for a case you think I should cover, leave it in the comments. You can always follow the channel on Instagram at thisis_monsters and purchase merch at thisismonsters.com. Thanks so much, and be safe.